Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. In the mid-1980s, Marvel and DC both released a limited-run 12-issue miniseries, both sharing the same basic premise of taking the biggest names in their company, both hero and villain alike, and gathering them together for a massive crossover, the consequences of which would have drastic effects on the characters and the company as a whole. These stories were Secret Wars and Crisis on Infinite Earths, respectively. Both stories were a massive success for the two companies, and still to this day remain highly influential to the universes of the companies and to pop culture as a whole. More importantly, they both learned just how profitable it was as well, showing that there was a market for these grandiose event comics. Unfortunately for us, they seemed to take the wrong lesson from what made these two stories so successful, as they would almost immediately cash in and begin to try and replicate the success of the two stories year after year after year, never quite seeming to realize what it was that made those stories work. Which is not to say they've all been failures. There are a great many deal of event stories that managed to reach the highs of their ancestors and managed to be equally as influential to their universes as they were, and definitely deserve praise. But there are just as many, if not more, events that are absolutely disastrous mistakes and total cash grabs, effectively derailing the universe as a whole with the consequences of the story, and utterly assassinating the characters, sometimes literally, who are unlucky enough to be caught in the spotlight. But what about the ones in between? The ones no one remembers, the ones that never get brought up outside of, oh yeah, that happened conversations. Many events fall to the wayside, often getting praise or scorn at the time, but largely fading to the background, the events of them becoming quickly irrelevant. Today's topic is one such event. Quite controversial in its time, but having no real lasting impact, it quickly faded into the background. Just in time for its 30th anniversary, we look back to DC Comics in 1991, with the event known as Armageddon 2001. Beginning in March and ending in October of 1991, primarily written by Archie Goodwin, with assistance by editor Denny O'Neil, and Dan Jurgens doing the art for the main book of the event, Armageddon was the first of DC's annual events, so named because rather than being spread out across the books themselves, or being solely contained in its own miniseries, the majority of the event was told through the various double-length annual issues DC put out during that year, with the setup and conclusion being told in its own individual issues. The basic premise behind the event goes like this. In the year 2001, one of Earth's greatest heroes turns evil, betraying and killing the rest of the heroes on Earth and taking over the world, adopting the moniker of Monarch. No, not that one, but God, I wish it was.
They threw me in jail. Literally, threw me right into the yard at the state prison. They shouts up to the warden, "Looks like this one won't be causing any more trouble." And he flies off with a Galen salute. Apparently nobody ever told him what due process was.
In order to save the future and prevent Monarch from rising to power, a hero from the future calling himself Wave Rider travels to the then current year of 1991, using his powers to search the personal timelines of each of Earth's heroes to discover who is destined to become Monarch, and put an end to Monarch's tyranny before it ever gets a chance to start. Each annual follows this basic premise, with Wave Rider and the reader following the respective heroes of each title to jump ahead to where they'll be in the year 2001, showing us what the current future holds in store for that hero. The event starts with the first of the two standalone issues of the event, which serves to set up the premise by showing Wave Rider's origin and explaining his motives. We watch as he rises from lowly scientist Matthew Ryder, fed up with the state of the world and his longing for the good old days of superheroes, as he discovers that Monarch is in the final stages of perfecting time travel, putting a plan into motion to take advantage of this and use Monarch's own invention to strike back against them and save history as we know it. It's not a terribly engaging story on its own, but it sets up everything it needs to. The book manages to set up Ryder's motivation and personality rather effectively, showing him growing ever frustrated with the state of the world and Monarch's rule, and his longing for the days of heroes like when he was a child, going so far as to track down forbidden historical data just to relive his past. We get a good view of his personal life, his crumbling relationship with his family, his job, while prestigious, is practically a dead end, The overall grim and pessimistic attitude in the air really sets for quite a bleak outlook on the future. You can certainly see why he would be willing to risk his life to try and go back in time, but personally it doesn't quite feel like we get enough to really justify why he ultimately decides to do so. The most we get is a sequence where we see him being rescued from an unspecified disaster as a child by a hero he can't identify, and being inspired by that hero, but other than that, not much is given to make him risking his life for his plan justified, especially since his entire plan hinges on Monarch's time travel device actually functioning properly, which he's told is barely working when he first finds out about it. Still, his admiration of the heroes of old being his primary influence works to at least give him enough of a cause to consider the risk. His entire plan is overall pretty risky too, relying mostly on luck in order to get Monarch's attention, and to even get Monarch to consider Ryder as a test subject for the experiment, but thankfully it all pays off in the end. I especially like this part where Ryder and Monarch have this verbal sparring match of sorts. It does a good job at highlighting the two's motives, and then following up with Monarch trying to probe Ryder's brain for any hidden agenda, only for Ryder to have planned ahead, and manipulating his conscious thoughts to trick Monarch is a really great idea. But again, is super luck dependent, so it's a miracle it worked for him at all things considered. Ryder's trip through time and his subsequent transformation into Wave Rider is visually exciting, but the dialogue is a bit repetitive. Wave Rider makes the same observations about time and the nature of the time stream and his place in it like 3 times in a row, and it starts to drag on. Wave Rider's design is very interesting as well. The glossy golden streaks comprising the center of his form, with the billowing flame-like energy acting as hair, and the flat black accenting serves as a great contrast, and the way it frequently shifts color or takes on the same flame-like form as his hair is particularly well rendered. Wave Rider has the power to be able to merge with someone's timeline, being able to see the sequence of events that their life would most likely follow as things currently are for them, which is convenient because otherwise he'd have no good way of being able to figure out who's supposed to be Monarch or not. His decision to go back to 10 years before Monarch was born is pretty suspect from a narrative standpoint. His reasoning early on even has him be unsure whether or not Monarch was planned ahead of time or a single impulsive event occurring, so going so far back only really wastes his own time, since for all he knows, Monarch might not even be an active hero at this time. Although obviously he did it so he'd be in line with contemporary continuity, of course, so this is just me being a nerd and nitpicking. Either way, the first issue is rather on the dull side, but accomplishes everything it needs to. Its biggest issue is that there's just too much padding. Ryder has the same rant about how his future sucks and how Monarch is a douche like 5 times, and the constant flashbacks and ramblings about heroes gets a bit old by the end. It does properly sell you on Wave Rider's motives, but feels a bit lacking in explaining the rationale of him actually going out of his way to act on his theories. From here, there's no real clear reading order for the event. A few of the annuals specifically lead into another, but otherwise can be read in any real order you choose. So we'll be going in release order. First up is Superman's Annual, Execution 2001, written by Dan Jurgens, with art by Dusty Abel. The premise is, and now stop me if you've heard this one before, focuses on Superman, who, after the death of Lois Lane and the destruction of Metropolis in a nuclear blast, became a cruel tyrant, imposing his own brand of law and order on the world, with the consequences of his actions no longer being a care for him. If this sounds familiar to you, that's because it's basically just the plot of the Injustice series, although there's enough of a significant difference to keep it from being too blatant of a ripoff. For starters, while Superman's still a cruel and uncaring bastard, he's not a psychotic murder machine like in that series, still caring about protecting innocent lives. It's an interesting take. It's evil Superman, but without the evil in a sense. He still has positive intentions, but he no longer cares about the subtleties of his influence on global affairs, and simply doing whatever he sees fit whenever he feels like it. It's presented rather well, how the death of Lois and the loss of Metropolis weighs heavily on his mind, and serve to heavily impact his life, him mentally separating Clark Kent and Superman as two people in his mind to justify his actions, and the strife it places on his relationship with the other heroes, with some like Batman supporting his actions, and others not. The story itself starts when Superman is accused of murder, allegedly killing several sailors after sinking a nuclear submarine in his attempts to forcibly disarm the US military. This conflict leads to Superman's life as it was beginning to collapse, culminating in a showdown with the Justice League, as well as forcing Batman to have to find out the truth behind the claims and interfere with Superman's affairs. The conflict is well executed, with the president shown with a clear bias against Superman and trying to do everything in his power to get rid of him, whereas Superman's own overblown ego prevents him from even considering that he's done anything wrong, which puts Batman and the others into a tough spot, with Superman's actions forcing them into having to stand against him. The fight with the League isn't all that interesting admittedly, but it's pretty clever seeing Superman go solo against everyone in a fight where, although he no longer cares about not harming them or what they think of him, he's still pulling his punches and trying not to kill them, and that's a fun aspect. Superman's arrogance and ego also harms him in that sense too, which leads to him inadvertently killing Martian Manhunter because he falsely assumed that his weakness to fire was no longer an issue. It's actually rather shocking. Superman's cold, callous dismissal of it, and refusing to take any blame for it, putting it all on Jean instead, really shows just how far gone Superman is in this reality. This forces Batman to finally take a stand against Superman, leading to a confrontation between the two as Batman prepares to put a stop to Superman. This also culminates in the twist ending, and for reference I won't be warning for spoilers to individual endings from here on, where it turns out that no, Superman did kill those sailors, falsely believing that the sub was fully abandoned as he failed to account for lead shielding in the sub. And it's actually a nice subversion since you'd normally expect it to be a fake out or a big cover-up. The fight itself is largely a condensed version of Superman and Batman's fight from Dark Knight Returns, right down to Batman having the special anti-Superman power armor. It is actually over relatively quick as Batman gets the drop on Supes with some kryptonite, killing Superman and putting an end to his rampage. It's actually a fairly sad ending in a way. Batman takes no glory or solace in killing Superman, and his sorrow of having to put an end to his longtime friend, no matter how much he had pre-planned for it, weighs heavily on him and leaves him to simply ponder what it'll be like when they decide to take down Batman instead. But whatever the case, Wave Rider decides that even in this twisted future, Superman wouldn't be Monarch, and moves on to his next target, deciding that if he's capable to take down Superman, then maybe he should try Batman next. This issue is overall very well done. The story is engaging, and it's an interesting take on the evil Superman concept, and feels fresh in that sense. The art is absolutely great. Superman is really well drawn. I like the alterations to his costume, and I think they work well. The Doctor Strange-esque cape and the boots with the folded cuffs, and the addition of gloves as well, really makes for a unique look and makes Superman feel visually distinct here, despite the overall minor alterations to his design. As mentioned, Superman's annual leads directly into Batman's, in a story optimistically titled The Last Batman Story, written by Alan Grant and with art by Jim Fern. In this version of the future, Batman's reached the twilight of his career. The Joker has been deemed sane and out on the streets a free man, Robin's quit and left the world of superheroics altogether, and many of Batman's villains are either dead or retired. Batman, however, continues his fight against crime alone until one fateful day when Batman accidentally kills the Penguin while trying to apprehend him. Batman, refusing to compromise his own ideals, allows himself to be sentenced to death for his actions, resulting in Robin and a returning Catwoman to race to try and clear Batman's name before it's too late. It's a good setup for a premise, Batman willingly letting himself be condemned for a crime that, while accidental, he still committed. It's a bit suspect that he would get the death sentence for killing a villain, or any amount of villains in any timeline, but there's at least justification for it, so it passes. Bruce adhering to it so stubbornly works well, with everyone, from a lowly prison guard to Commissioner Gordon, doing everything they can to try and convince Batman to bust out, only for him to refuse is an interesting angle to take. Had he, and by the extension the audience, known it was a trick to try and get rid of him the whole time, it'd make him look pretty stupid though. Thankfully, the second he realizes it wasn't his fault, he immediately works on busting out of jail. A bit too much time is spent on the Joker in this story though. I like how he decides that immediately after being deemed sane and getting out of Arkham, he decides to become a talk show host, like all former crazy people do. And it's a fun gag, but his scenes tend to drag and they're not all that entertaining. It also has the unintended effect of making it way too obvious that Joker was the one behind the cover-up. Although granted, Joker could have been on one page up until the climax, and he'd still be the most obvious suspect purely by virtue of being the fucking Joker. But I did like that they gave Catwoman a part here. Having her try and bail out Batman by uncovering the real killer is a good angle for her, and works well with her character. Although her scenes mostly consist of her running into a place, beating the shit out of some guys, and then running off, she does actually get pretty close to uncovering the truth on her own, and Killer Croc jobbing out to her is pretty funny. The actual climax is a bit rushed though. Batman lures Joker to his prison cell for an interview, only to pull a conveniently timed switcheroo with Anarchy of all fucking characters, and partners back up with Robin as they head off to Joker's studio to find evidence he's behind all the villain murders. Catwoman dies, rather pointlessly I might add, and Joker arrives to do battle with Batman. Joker explains his motives as, I wanted to trick everyone into thinking I was sane for the hell of it, essentially, which I guess is as good of a motive as any for Joker, and confesses to having been behind all the villain killings, basically all just to fuck with Batman. This culminates in the two's duel, ending with the Joker accidentally killing himself by electrocution, finally putting an end to his reign of terror and an effective end of an era. The ending itself is weirdly poignant, if abrupt. Batman cracking a joke at Joker's expense in a seemingly genuine laugh, followed by the grim sorrow sinking in, is a strange sight to behold. Nevertheless, Wave Rider is satisfied with his search, revealing himself to Batman and telling him with confidence that he is not Monarch, and continues his search once more. This is another good story. I like the concepts Grant uses, and he has a real good grasp on Batman's personality. This one also has an issue of trying to fill space effectively, but it manages to have less problems overall than the first issue does. That being said, I really did not like the art here at all. It reminds me a lot of Frank Miller's more modern art, and I don't mean that as a compliment. The coloring doesn't quite work either. Some pages are filled with far too bright or saturated colors, and the others are so heavily coated in black that it makes everything seem like it's happening in the damn Phantom Zone or something. Next up is the Justice League America issue, as always written by Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis, with a revolving door of artists. This one intersects with an ongoing story arc in the main title. Within the pages of JLA proper, the team's financial backer and de facto leader, Maxwell Lord, had been shot and left for dead by an unknown assailant. With his life on the line and the fate of the Justice League hanging in the balance, the anxieties and fears of the team are at an all-time high. Perfect time for some jackass from the future to come poking around now, isn't it? This one's an ensemble piece, with each leaguer getting their own tiny separate glimpse into their futures, but all of which tie into a larger narrative in place, sans Jean's, whose story is entirely standalone, and Captain Atom, who's away on other business, with Wave Rider taking his identity to move about unnoticed between the League. In this version of the future, the League has been disbanded outright, with many of the members seemingly retiring from heroics outright or moving on to other things. It's quite varied and has a nice balance of serious and comedic, jumping from Guy Gardner's future, where he's the leader of a literal, actual cult about himself, to Blue Beetles, who's become a depressed, overweight mess after getting screwed out of the rights to his own hero identity, living as a sad, broken man with no real prospects to speak of. Because there's so many members and only so many pages of space, everyone only gets a few pages each of content, but thankfully nothing gets rushed through, largely since they're all sharing the same future. And I like how everything flows together in a neat narrative, with the events of one hero's future leading into the events of another, and keeping a continuous story going. Guy's massive cult turning on him after a blow to the head reverts him back to his original, kind pacifist self, leads into Ice finding out and reuniting with Guy, leading to the two getting married, and Blue Beetle's self-pitying moping about, regretting selling off his hero identity, leads to him discovering it was Fire who was behind the contractual fuckery, resulting in him freaking out and getting arrested. This culminates in Booster, who's now stuck back in the future after also selling off his hero identity, finding out all of this from a museum set piece, which convinces him to try and go back to the present and get Max back and the League reunited. It's very soap opera-y in that sense, and Giffen and DeMatteis' usual blending of comedy and drama aid the story well. So far, Armageddon's kept up a pretty decent level of quality, and this keeps the trend going. The art is nice and varied, and there's an attempt to keep the looks of everyone consistent between artists. Every leaguer feels well utilized with their contributions to the overall narrative, and I do like that it ultimately has a happy ending, with the League starting to be revived once more. But unfortunately for everyone in the present, Wave Rider makes things worse by trying to see Max's history, which only makes his situation all that much worse. And I mean, come on, Wave Rider. Who could possibly expect Maxwell Lord, of all people, to be a supervillain? I mean, come on, that's just ridiculous. Coming up next is Hawk and Dove's Annual, written by Barbara Kessel and a combination of different artists. Apparently someone on this book missed the memo about what the premise of the event was, because Hawk and Dove's futures show them living and surviving in the future that Wave Rider originated from, which shouldn't technically exist yet since they're only jumping ahead 10 years in time here. This one's pretty disjointed and doesn't really follow any clear narrative, so it's a bit hard to talk about. But it opens up with Wave Rider seeing Hawk's future, seeing that he's so far been able to stay alive and hidden by becoming one of Monarch's stormtroopers. Until one day when he finally decides he's done hiding and lashes out against the Tyrant's new order, calling out Monarch for a climactic one-on-one battle. It's overall pretty dumb, the fight is boring, and we're given very little to see how this new future has affected Hawk. With Dove dead and him serving, presumably unwillingly, the monster who killed her doesn't really seem to have affected him in any way. Although Hawk's always been a total lunatic, so for all we know that's just the intent. Hawk has gained a new power to transform into a giant dragon bird thing, but it's not all that exciting. Monarch no-sells most of Hawk's attacks, and Hawk mostly spends his time flailing about not doing much of significance, eventually deciding to fuck off to another dimension to escape Monarch as his part ends. The art here is just absolutely terrible. The proportions are all off and constantly shifting from panel to panel, with poses that are stiff at their best and utterly hilarious at their worst. The coloring as well is rather sloppy. It's oftentimes too saturated, and there's almost no attempt at blending tones, with colors being haphazardly layered onto one another with little regard for where light sources should be or how the colors should be affected. The second half is a little better, however, with Dove, who for reasons not explained, is able to take control over Wave Rider's powers, taking him on a journey through several quick snapshots of the many potential futures that await her, as well as taking him back through his own origin. I quite like this direction, although how is more or less glossed over. Dove basically giving no good explanation other than order and chaos lol, but the idea of Wave Rider getting his powers hijacked is clever, and this isn't the only story that uses it either. The different glimpses of the future are all varied, and each having gone in quite radical directions. Dove as an ambassador to some alien armada, convincing them to band together to stop Monarch. Dove having seemingly ascended to some higher level of being while hiding from Monarch, one where both Hawk and Dove survived living long enough to raise a child who would be capable of stopping Monarch, and a couple other brief snippets. No one future gets focused on for very long, but in this situation it's fine. It's meant to be a be careful what you wish for scenario for Wave Rider, so having him getting bombarded by a bunch of different outcomes makes it work. This closes off with a view of Hawk and Dove's hypothetical child, who survived to adulthood and inherits the duo's combined powers, leading to her setting off to a final showdown with Monarch to save the world. It's admittedly a bit on the cheesy side, and Monarch jobbing out super hard and getting killed feels a bit out of place, and reduces Monarch's threat to a degree. Thematically though, it's a good payoff. Ultimately, Wave Rider is released from Dove's control, and he leaves them be, fully confident that no matter what happens, no matter what future awaits them, that in each and every one of them, there is absolutely no chance in any way that either Hawk or Dove could ever be Monarch in any way. Overall, this one is a step down in quality from the prior annuals, but has some interesting ideas within it. Its biggest problem is that it really missed the mark on the premise by having Hawk and Dove's futures be so closely tied to Monarch, making it really too narrow for them to be able to do much. The art pretty drastically varies in quality, but at its best it's mostly fine and has nothing that really stands out about it, good or bad. Following on from that, we have Action Comics with another Superman story? Wave Rider, my guy, what gives? You're double dipping, man, you're never gonna find Monarch this way, come on. Anyways, the story this time, titled Executive Action, is written by Roger Stern and Tom Grummett on art. After opening up with an utterly pointless sequence where Superman fights Calabac for no good reason and which never gets mentioned again, we get to our view of the new future. The book justifies the additional storyline by saying that Superman, for whatever reason, was able to subconsciously retain memories of the original future we were shown, which allowed him to know where Intergang's bomb would be and giving him enough time to disarm it and save Metropolis, leading to a new timeline. In this new, more peaceful timeline, Clark is invited by his longtime friend Pete Ross to help him as the campaign manager for his upcoming bid for President of the United States. However, in a stroke of bad luck, Pete is attacked on the campaign trail, forcing him to drop out, and more importantly resulting in Clark accidentally revealing his identity as Superman to the world. But Pete is able to convince Clark to take his place, leading to Superman entering the running to become president. I think the what if a superhero openly ran for a political position angle could have been done well, but here it's not particularly exciting. A lot of the actual race for the presidency is pretty condensed. Superman has exactly one speech and half of a debate, and that's about it. Superman winning and becoming president is pretty much expected, with the second half focusing on his actual presidency, and even then, a lot of that gets condensed. The biggest issue with the story is that Superman faces basically no adversity from the moment he enters the running. Every obstacle that he runs into is immediately and perfectly solved with no issues, and never facing any problems with his goals or any of the policies he tries to put into place, whether it be from unexpected setbacks and disasters or political lobbying trying to block him. And while many of these can be chalked up to because he's fucking Superman, the problem is that it doesn't make for an exciting story to see everything go perfectly for our hero. The closest we get is early on, when he first joins the race, and the argument is raised about whether or not Superman should be allowed to run, since not technically being born in America makes him ineligible to run, but this is pretty much glossed over and he overwhelmingly gets the pass. It'd be interesting to talk about the ethics of a superhero, especially someone like Superman, running for a political office, whether they should be allowed to still be a hero or whether that might be a conflict of interests. Or seeing Superman actually have to struggle with trying to get foreign powers or the Senate to side with him, and dealing with corporate or political lobbyists trying to sway him. But all of that is put aside, and we get a saccharine and impossibly idyllic world where Superman basically solves all the problems in the world with no effort, and the logistics of such changes never really being addressed. The closest he gets to any kind of pushback or conflict is when he tries to get a bunch of the world's hero teams to unite as one to try and work to disarm the global powers of their weaponry and armed forces, leading to pushback from Guy Gardner. Guy is portrayed as a hot-headed nuisance, understandably considering it's Guy Gardner, whose argument boils down to just accusing Superman of treason, immediately lashing out at Superman and leading to a big dumb fight, during which Superman pretty much no-sells Guy's attacks, and literally steals Guy's ring by willing it off of him. The whole thing is basically just one deus ex machina after another, and really results in a pretty dull story. The concept of President Superman is squandered, and it feels like lazy wish fulfillment. It's fortunate that we have a different President Superman, so the disappointment isn't as big. I will say that I like the ending where Superman once again retains memories of the future, using Wave Rider's vision of seeing an accident befall Pa Kent to be able to run off and stop it before it happens. It's a cute moment, and that, at the very least, feels earned. Moving on, we get Hawkworld, with Racing Against Time, written by John Ostrander and Gary Kwapis on art. We join the perpetually perplexing Hawkman and Hawkwoman in their quest to keep the main streets of Chicago clean from crime. When Wave Rider comes along, we get a view of Qatar's soon-to-be future, with him having retired from heroics to lead a more peaceful life as an activist. However, he's slowly gotten fed up with how helpless he feels in this position, and makes the decision to return to action as Hawkman once more, flaring up animosity from an old foe. Not being that familiar with Ostrander's Hawkworld, or Hawkman in general, I don't have much to say about this one, but I found it enjoyable. I find Qatar's plight rather relatable. That feeling of futility when no matter what you try ends in failure is a very common one, and can often lead the mind to wander to some dark places. Shiera being the one to push him to return to being Hawkman is nice as well. I like that even after years apart, they're still good enough friends and know each other well enough to be able to help like that. The villain of the story, Attila, is set up with a pre-established history with Hawkman, although whether or not they'd ever showed up before or after this, I couldn't say. But the idea isn't half bad. I like the idea of a supervillain's child picking up the torch to get revenge on a hero, and the design isn't half bad, but the general motive is pretty generic, being weirdly hyper-Christian and seeking to cause the apocalypse because hamburger. But the climax is fun, with Qatar forcing his way into taking control of Attila, and the sheer, overwhelming power and force it possesses nearly driving Qatar mad, before he forces himself out at the last second is a really good sequence. And I like how it leaves Qatar questioning whether or not he should have or not. It's a great little story, and feels very concise with the message it wants to tell. The art is pretty solid and has a nice, realistic quality to it, and keeps the action feeling very grounded. Although the coloring is really bad here, with everything being really hyper-saturated, and it makes it rather difficult to look at. Although whether that's the work of the colorist, or the quality of the scans I could find, I can't say for sure. Wave Rider isn't fully convinced by Hawkman's future, but decides that him willingly giving up his newfound power means that he likely wouldn't be Monarch, and moves on. Coming up next, we have Detective Comics with another fucking Batman story? Come on, are you serious? Ugh. Anyways, we have Succession by Louise Simonson and Tom Grindberg. Wave Rider decides, for absolutely no reason, to take the form of one of Batman's regular rogues and confront him before checking his future again, assuming based on absolutely zero evidence that by reading his future when he's in a darker, more vile mood, will produce a new outcome. Somehow this works, and we're shown a new version of the future. In this timeline, following a climactic final battle with Ra's al Ghul, Batman is left permanently crippled and forced into retirement, leading to a massive, unprecedented crime wave to strike Gotham in his absence. This one is split into 2 chapters. The first deals with the lead up to Batman's accident and the fallout thereof, dealing with the already worsening Gotham spiraling into a full-on crisis state with the loss of Batman. While it's not much of a shock to see Gotham fall apart like this, Batman stubs his toe and the whole city dissolves into a damn war zone, seeing a broken and dejected Batman just completely and utterly give up after his accident is rather surprising, especially when comparing similar stories. It carries a pretty grim tone and leads to Bruce worsening his relationship with Tim, his utter stubborn refusal to try anything anymore, pushing Tim to take his place as Batman. This leads to a good subversion, leading you to think that the story will be about Tim secretly becoming Batman without Bruce knowing, but it only ends up lasting a short while as Tim is unceremoniously shot and killed pretty early into his tenure as the Bat. It's a nice shift for the story, but it's a bit disappointed that it happened so quickly. Tim wears the costume for about 2 pages before getting shot. Still, the abruptness of it is well handled. Bruce's freak out when he finds out is very tragic, and the art does a really great job at conveying his grief, him lashing out at Alfred and shedding tears while clutching onto Tim's old costume. Alfred finally lashing out and giving Bruce some well-deserved shit for his crybaby behavior finally convinces him to get off his ass and actually try something to fix things. This leads to the second chapter, with Bruce working himself into madness to repair his body, turning himself into a full-on cyborg in the process. Batman, now more powerful than ever, tears through Gotham, wreaking havoc on everyone and everything in his path as he tries to hunt down the ones who killed Tim. The concept is interesting, but it falls flat in some areas. Batman being so mad with grief and his newfound strength going totally ballistic is great, but nothing much is done with the idea of a psycho Batman. No one really comments on the change in his methods, save for Gordon. I would have liked it more if they played with the idea of Bruce losing his humanity in a way, adopting more and more brutal tactics and finding a need to continuously improve himself and slowly losing more and more of his humanity would have been a good angle to go with. And it's present at the surface level, but it isn't utilized to its fullest. His search for Tim's killers is well handled though. Batman's increasing frustration and the constant dead ends, leading him to growing more desperate every night, is represented fairly well, but again falls flat with not quite exploring it beyond a fairly superficial level. Ultimately, the story comes full circle when Batman discovers that it was Talia and the League of Shadows who killed Tim, leading to Batman to return to where it all started to confront them. Talia's motive for killing Tim was kind of lazy. She naturally thought he was Bruce, but why the hell she tried shooting him to death if she wanted to capture him is totally bonkers. But the ending with Bruce letting Talia drop him into the Lazarus pit, only to trigger a bomb he put into his body to blow up the base and destroy the pit, is really good. I like the book ending with how everything started with Batman killing Ra's and ended with him killing Talia. The futility of everything in the end is a good way to end it in my opinion. Overall, this one was pretty lackluster. It had too many ideas it wanted to try and didn't really commit to any of them, and what it tries isn't utilized to the fullest. But I really liked the gloomy aesthetic and dull, muted colors here. It adds a lot to the story. Following that we have Oh For the Love of God! We have Adventures of Superman, with Beyond the Reach of Time, also by Louise Simonson and Brian Hitch on the art. In this future, Clark and Lois decide to have a child together. However, Lois is accidentally killed during pregnancy by the super baby. The resulting grief and frustration Clark feels leading him to abandon Earth and going on a suicide dive through space. However, Superman is rescued by the villain Maxima, who puts into action another plan to try and get Superman to fuck her. Right, I'm just going to speed through this one because in all honesty, I really do not like it and I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I just don't like the premise, plain and simple. I've never been a big fan of the, oh, Superman would go crazy with rage, grief, etc. if Lois ever died trope, and while I can think of many instances where it gets used well, hell, look back to the start of this episode, here it's just lazily used and it feels like it comes in and out of the story when it feels like it. I also disagree with the idea that Superman would leave Earth over his grief, even temporarily, and especially on a weird pseudo-suicide attempt. It's one thing for him to go into hiding or stop being Superman, but him trying to outright kill himself and abandon Earth is radically out of character. The entire premise feels like a lazy shipping fanfic, where the writer just really desperately wants their preferred pairing to happen, so they just completely toss characterization out the window in order for the plot to make any sense. Because of that, I can't really care much about Maxima's motives or her plans to woo Superman, and the internal politics of her people and her world are a drag and don't really matter in any significant way. I do like how Maxima's plan is essentially, hey, maybe if I try to be nice, Superman will actually like me. Funny how it's the one thing she never considered in all these years. The whole double cross that happens makes no sense though, because it's Maxima's dumbass assistant who suggests the plan to start with, and then she gets mad that the plan is working and plots against Maxima, which is completely asinine. All the lovey-dovey crap is just generic, and I don't really believe any of it. This is arguably the weakest of the bunch, and doesn't really contribute anything of worth. I will say that Brian Hitch's art is really good here. His style is very expressive, and he's able to pack a lot of detail into very little space. Although the coloring ruins it somewhat by using too many overlapping or similar toned colors, which makes everything blend together and it becomes a strain to look at. Now that we're free of repeats, we move on to Legion, as always written by Alan Grant with Mike McKone doing the art. Legion is a series that the average person would likely be unfamiliar with, but thankfully I did an episode about them earlier, so if you need a quick setup, go and check that out first. After a quick prologue where Wave Rider decides to check Lobo's future, seeing that he's basically going to be exactly the same in 10 years' time, Wave Rider moves on to investigate the jolly green jackass himself, Vril Dox. Now exactly why Wave Rider would ever think that a glory hound like Dox would need to dress himself up to take over Earth, or why he would give enough of a shit to want to conquer just Earth to begin with, is never explained or acknowledged, so don't bother asking any more questions about it. However, Dox, working on time experiments of his own, manages to get the drop on Wave Rider and capture him, effectively holding him hostage as Wave Rider takes a look at Dox's future, his own life hanging in the balance. In 10 years' time, Dox has seemingly abandoned the ideals he founded Legion for, turning it from being a force for peace and justice throughout the galaxy into a brutal and violent dictatorship, ruling the worlds they police as tyrants. But when Dox puts into motion a plan that will allow him to take near-complete control of the galaxy in very little time, the now former Legion elite reunite to take out Dox and put an end to his reign of terror before it's too late. This one is absolutely amazing, although my only major issue is that unlike the rest of the annuals, it requires you to be familiar with the cast and the ongoing plot of the main book in order to follow along, which while not an issue for me, might make it more difficult for some. But we have some quality Legion content here. A running theme throughout the main series is Dox's morality, whether he truly believes in his quest for justice, or if it's just a front to gain power. And here it's taken to the extreme end, with Dox, and, for some reason, Lady Quark, living like royalty and almost gleefully relishing in the chaos they spread. And it does a good job at showcasing the diverse cast of the book, with each member having their own thoughts on the situation, and each having their own motives for either staying with or leaving Legion after Dox went full tyrant, some unsure of whether they made the right move or not. It takes the inherently fascist undertones Legion provides and brings them to the forefront, with the organization now being a brutal and borderline psychotic agency looking for any and all excuses to beat down and oppress the worlds they control, arresting people for whatever reason they deem fit, and subjecting them to literal brainwashing to make them perfect subservient subjects. I like how even despite all that, some of the old crew remains, desperately trying in vain to stick to the vision that Legion was founded on. The first half is mostly setup and character set pieces, and most of the major crew get a lengthy scene dedicated to them, although some, such as Mara Jen and Captain Comet, get shafted a bit. But I like the where are they now aspect, and the scene with everyone finally reconvening after so long and catching up is really heartwarming. Legion's cast was always one of its strong points, and I'm glad that's represented here as well. The second half switches to a more action-focused view, with it pretty much being a lengthy series of fights one after another as the gang decides to finally go tell Dox to go fuck himself and put an end to his tyranny. Phase discovers that Dox's plan involves a mysterious device that can merge living matter into horrid abominations, plotting to fuse him and Lady Quark together to become unstoppable. The big twist is rather effective as well, with the reveal that Dox and Lady Quark have actually been under the control of the computer tyrants, who hijacked their brains sometime after their previous battle, putting an additional level of danger and urgency into the plan. Unfortunately for them, the tyrants were one step ahead of them to begin with, leading to a shootout with their right-hand goon. The violence escalates pretty far here, with the book going full kill-em-all tier by having a good chunk of the crew shot dead in the firefight, and Legion goons getting caught in the crossfire on the way. It's very fast-paced, but never gets to the point that it's hard to follow. My only real issue I have with it, honestly, is that Lobo barely gets to do anything. Up until the last few pages, Dox has had him locked up in stasis, putting him on display like a trophy, which granted I think is a brilliant idea, but by the time he gets freed, all the fighting is basically over, and everybody but the tyrants has gotten their asses kicked. The tyrants' fused form is absolutely terrifying. Dox and Lady Quark's being a part of their arms, held out like trophies, is quite disturbing. and the giant finger-like claws are a really creepy visual. The actual fight with the tyrants is short but very brutal, and the ending is pretty shocking too. With no 11th hour cavalry, or sudden heroic rescue, the Legion Elite are slain, and with no one left to stand in their way, the computer tyrants take flight, ready to plunge the galaxy into chaos. Fortunately, Wave Rider's vision is enough to convince Dox to abandon his experiments and preventing that timeline from ever occurring. Even though him talking to Dox in the first place was what allowed the entire scenario to occur, but Wave Rider hasn't taken responsibility for his mistakes yet, and he's not planning to anytime soon. And so, Wave Rider is set free, confident that Dox wouldn't be Monarch, and Dox is once again forced against his will to learn a lesson about not being a psychopath. An absolutely stellar issue, although somewhat hindered by its heavy adherence to the ongoing plot threads of the main title. It's a great alternate future and builds on what makes the main book great, and Grant manages to once again put out some stellar work. McCone's art is really good, and he does a great job at packing lots of detail into the panels, but I'm personally not a big fan of the more realistic style he draws the characters in. Not that it's bad, it's quite good in fact, but personally I prefer Kitson's style from the main book. We make our way back to Earth, just in time for the Flash Annual, with Family Business, written by then main series writer Mark Waid, and Craig Brassfield on the art. Wave Rider comes across Flash as he basks in the glory of Flash Appreciation Day. However, the festivities are interrupted when a mysterious woman named Bonnie Blackman seeks out Wally to discuss a bizarre mystery. But Wave Rider, having no concept of personal space, decides to interrupt here to get his vision. In this future, Wally helps Bonnie uncover a massive criminal conspiracy involving her new boss, Mr. Diogenes, and dismantle his operations, getting him locked up for life. However, Diogenes, a metahuman with the power to instantly learn anything and everything about whoever he puts his hands on, goes on a violent crusade of vengeance against the two, forcing Wally and Bonnie into the Witness Protection Program for their own safety. Now happily married, Wally and Bonnie live in secret with their son David, safe from Diogenes' vengeance. Or so they assume, as unbeknownst to them, Diogenes has learned where they are, kidnapping their son in the process, and forcing Wally to come out of retirement for one last time in order to save his son. Personally, I feel that the premise here has some holes in it. I don't find Wally and Bonnie's relationship very believable. There's not much really given to make you believe that Wally would be willing to throw away his friends and former life for the woman. Although since we do fast forward through a majority of the relationship and the trip to the future, maybe we're just missing something. I do like the angle of superhero enters witness protection, however. I think it has potential for some really interesting story elements, both serious and comedic. While it doesn't get utilized to its fullest here, again we are jumping in right at the end of the story, so it's understandable. But Wade captures the grief and longing Wally feels well, how even all these many years later he still wishes he could go back to his old life, as well as the paranoia the two feel constantly, worrying and thinking somebody's watching them, only to unfortunately be proven right when Captain Cold is able to blow their cover. The angle with Wally's son is also interesting. His son was born with his super speed powers, but lacked Wally's protection from friction and the other effects that super speed would do to the human body, making his son a walking, or running I guess, time bomb and requiring near 24/7 observation to the point where he's forced to stay inside near constantly. You can tell Wally genuinely worries and hates that he can't really talk to any other heroes to share the grief with, and that emotional weight drags him down, especially when his fears are realized and his son damn near kills himself trying to save a girl. And Diogenes is a pretty intimidating villain. Despite by all accounts being an ordinary businessman, the ability to completely read your innermost thoughts without you ever even realizing it has some genuinely horrifying implications, and I think it's captured pretty well. Him using this to blackmail the rogues and damn near every other Flash villain to forming his own personal army to try and kill Wally before he can expose him is an impressive feat, but sadly we only hear about this secondhand rather than getting to see it. After kidnapping his son, Diogenes puts his scheme for revenge into action, once more rounding up a collection of some of Flash's remaining rogues as part of a plot to steal Wally's speed powers for his own because hamburger. From here, it's a veritable boss rush of mostly B-listers admittedly. Weather Wizard, the Turtles' old mooks Slow, Steady, and Sprint, Rainbow Raider, Golden Glider, and the debuting Chillblaine, and culminating in the brand new villain Paradox, who never appears again after this point. The entire thing is of course a front. Diogenes expects Flash to win to lure him to where he's hiding so he can kill him himself after completely stealing his speed powers, stringing Wally along a predetermined path to maximize the power drain. The intricacy of the plan seems a bit unnecessary, all things considered. It's not even like he's trying to buy time or otherwise distract Flash from some other end goal, but I suppose he's lucky that Flash is so super turbo pissed that he follows along perfectly. That being said, I do like how Wally realizes he's being strung along, almost instantly at least, but he's so desperate that he's willing to do anything. Most of the fights are brief, with the villains jobbing near instantly, even with Flash's radically dropping power level, but they start to get more interesting as Wally loses his speed, forcing him to get more creative with his strategies and play the villains' gimmicks against them. And the last fight with a near-powerless Flash against Paradox is creative. Watching him struggle against obstacles that would have been nothing to him less than an hour prior is a great obstacle to put him against. And Flash nearly outright gutting Paradox after joking about killing his son is actually a bit shocking to see. Ultimately, Diogenes gets exactly what he wants, transferring Flash's speed into his son, but this ends up backfiring as the power overwhelms him, killing him instantly and leading Diogenes to having a heart attack, putting an end to the nightmare. The story has a really great, bittersweet ending, with Wally willingly giving up taking his powers back and instead transferring it to David, his son, leaving him the Flash ring and passing on the torch to his son. Wally West, the Flash, is no more, but now they're free to live happy, peaceful lives out of witness protection, leaving his son to carry on the legacy of the Flash. At least he would if Wave Rider's interference didn't distract Flash long enough to let Diogenes catch up to Bonnie back in the present, and drag her off before they can talk. Wally dismissing it as nothing worth worrying about. God damn, that's a bleak ending. Especially since none of the characters ever got mentioned again, you can only wonder what the fuck happened. It's a pretty standard Wade-era Flash story, but this is pretty good. It doesn't quite utilize the premise to its fullest, but does a good job at setting up all the characters and properly establishing motives. It covers all the bases well, but doesn't really excel in any specific area. The art as well isn't anything special. Fundamentally it's good and there's nothing glaringly wrong to point to, but it doesn't really excite or stand out in any way. Although a lot of the additional detailing makes characters look really lumpy and like they're some sort of misshapen blob person. One thing I think is a weirdly missed opportunity is that they never mentioned David again after this. The Flash, especially modern Flash, is all about the wacky cross-universal team-up shenanigans, so I'm surprised no writer ever pulled some hyper-time bullshit to bring him into the main continuity, even if just for one arc. Although now that Wally's back in the main book now's as good a time as any, I suppose. We're in the final stretch now, with The New Titans for 2001, A Titan's Odyssey. As always, written by Marv Wolfman and Tom Grindberg on the art. Directly intersecting with the previous storyline in the main book, with the Titans captured by the Wildebeest Society, Wave Rider takes this opportunity to read Nightwing's future and not help him escape or anything like that. Why the hell would he do that, right? In this nightmarish future, Nightwing is still a part of the Titans, now an underground resistance movement striking from the shadows, in a dystopian nightmare world where the general populace is under total submissive control due to a constant influx of mind-altering numb dust pumped into the food, water, and air supplies, ruled by an iron fist by the enigmatic UG Corp and their owner, the psychotic madman Lord Chaos. Having uncovered evidence of Chaos's whereabouts, the new Team Titans set off to try and take down Chaos once and for all.
We're here to kill Chaos.
I like the espionage angle. Watching Nightwing and the heroes use sneaky hit-and-run type tactics is an interesting angle. They're not very good at it, but it's still interesting. Man, I'm sure Batman is embarrassed for you, Dick. And on the topic, the new Titans aren't all that interesting. None of the old team remains except for Nightwing. Well, okay, and Terra's back now too, don't ask, trust me. And the replacements aren't particularly noteworthy. A basic shapeshifter, a guy made of energy, not Hawkgirl, and a literal vampire, none of whom have much of a personality to speak of and relatively uninteresting designs. Dick's new costume as well is pretty bad, an armored, tactical version of his old costume that just doesn't really have any cohesion to it. I like the shield though, interesting choice for him, but he makes it work. Chaos as well is a flat villain, not having much of a motive beyond take over the world because evil, and he has a very incoherent aesthetic. Chaos himself is a magical, godlike being with immense power and with a flamboyant theatrical presentation, but he's also a corrupt businessman running a New World Order megacorp trying to enslave the global populace with drugged food supplies, and he's also working with evil aliens too. It almost feels like Wolfman wrote out the whole plot and then had the idea for Chaos later, so he inserted him into the story without changing anything to make it work. But Chaos's personal hatred for the Titans is built up too well, frequently going out of his way to personally spite Nightwing just for the hell of it seems, driving him crazy by taunting him about the presumed dead Titans, and building his not-so-secret base on the ruins of Titan's Tower. A lot of the action isn't all that interesting, mostly devolving into one big shootout after another, which makes it a bit hard to believe these guys have lasted as long as they did. The actual reveal of Chaos's motives, after the Titans blunder their way into his base and get captured, is well executed. Chaos reveals that he's actually the son of Donna Troy, being born with the full might of the Greek Titans, which he used to kill Donna and begin his plan to conquer the world for the gods. It's framed really well, and I like the hint of guilt he has in killing Donna. It adds a bit to his character. Fortunately for the Titans, Chaos fucks off and leaves his alien goons to kill them, who immediately fail to do so, the Titans escaping and blasting Chaos's base to bits as they fly off to fight another day. With this, Wave Rider is confident that Nightwing isn't Monarch, and continues his quest elsewhere while leaving Dick to get taken away and brutally tortured by the wildebeests. However, the story doesn't quite end there, as we return to the future and the Titans' mysterious benefactor, who puts into motion his final plan to rid the world of Chaos. Now that he's aware of Chaos's origin, he prepares to send his Team Titans back in time to the present day, declaring that in order to save the world, save the future and all mankind, then Donna Troy must die. This one's not all that great, admittedly. I like the concept, but it feels like there's too many ideas going on here at once, and a lot of the more important info is left out or condensed. I do like that it's used as a springboard for stories in the main title. It's the only book in the entire event that does so, but because of that, the actual annual feels weak as a part of the event overall. I'm not sure I agree with the choice to focus on solely Nightwing and none of the other Titans, but with when the issue would have been written and the current storyline of the main book, it would have been really awkward to fit it in any other way. The art also drags it down for me as well. It's pretty sloppy in places, and the framing and action feels particularly stiff. Nightwing looks like he's a fucking meth addict in half the pages, and the coloring is pretty flat and nothing sensational either. Finally, the storyline culminates in the last annual, Justice League Europe, with Too Much Time, written by Keith Giffen and He Who Shall Not Be Named, and a massive list of some of the top artists of the time. With the European League returning after some shenanigans that went on during the main books, stemming from the aforementioned incident with Max Lord, the JLE returned to their embassy base to find Superman and Wave Rider waiting for them. Apparently, Wave Rider decided to get Superman's help after the 8 billionth time he checked his future, asking him to help round up the last remaining major suspects to finish his search for Monarch. The League, not exactly willing to trust Wave Rider, agreed to his requests, as Wave Rider scans through each member of the JLE, except for Flash because he already did that Flash and I guess he's not important enough for him to double dip on, and Captain Atom, who, once again, is conveniently absent when he's around. However, Wave Rider quickly finds nothing but more and more irregular visions as he witnesses the embassy vanish off the face of the Earth, and the League scattered around all across the world in a multitude of different eras. Similar to the JLA book, this one is another ensemble piece, with each individual member getting their own little spotlight. However, unlike JLA, which had a clear narrative running through each part that tied them together in chronological order, the JLE segments are all standalone, with each Leaguer being sent to a different place in a different time, encountering another DC hero along the way, and typically getting into shenanigans. Because of this, it takes a more directly comedic tone, with largely farcical segments, with characters mostly just tossed around to wherever they feel like it because it seems fun. And it is fun. Each part is brief, only about 4 pages each, but they each do a wonderful job at setting the scene and getting some laughs in too, each part having a different artist that helps to differentiate them from one another. Rocket Reds has him sent back to Camelot in the time of King Arthur, impressing Arthur with his abilities and becoming an honorary member of the Knights of the Round Table. It's cute, and I like how quickly Red finds himself acclimating to his new situation and becoming friends with Arthur, and making Merlin seethe in the process is a nice touch. I love that Merlin gets so butthurt about Red making him look like a chump he sends Etrigan to go kick his ass. It's so amazingly petty, I love it. Power Girl finds herself stuck in World War II during the London Blitz, where she runs afoul of General Glory, who's doing everything in his power to get Kara to tag along with him, whether she wants to or not. Personally, I don't think Kara gets to do enough here. Her arguing with Glory takes up most of the page count, and otherwise nothing much happens. It would have been fun to see her team up with one of the JSA instead, but she already has the pre-established history with Glory too, who is a more immediately relevant character, so his inclusion makes sense. Still, I like Glory's almost obsessive quest to get PG to team up with him, culminating in him forcing her to become his new sidekick after his original one gets unceremoniously blasted to bits, Kara's sheer disapproval being a great way to end it off. Metamorpho ends up in an unspecified apocalypse, where he teams up with Jonah Hex after saving his life from a group of bandits. Nothing really funny happens in this one until the last page. A majority of the segment is just Rex beating down some goons in a one-sided fight, but the last page is so jam-packed with comedy it makes up for it. Metamorpho's banter with Hex is absolute gold, and it's a shock how well the two work together. Giffen's art here really enhances the scene. His gritty, rigid style and heavy use of black lead to a very grim style, perfect for the apocalyptic setting, and it contrasts nicely with the humor. Silver Sorceress is sent all the way back to the time of the dinosaurs, where she runs afoul of Anthro. This is the weakest of the segments personally. Nothing is really done with her being in prehistoric times, and half the runtime is just her standing around as Anthro beats up a dinosaur. The art's really good though, I'll give it that much. Crimson Fox gets sent to the Old West, inadvertently saving Batlash's life, and leading to the duo forming an unlikely partnership in the process. I'm glad Bat got to show up, he's super underrated. Wish he was in more of it though. And I think Fox and Bat play off of each other surprisingly well. I'd love to see a full issue's worth of this team up. As it is, it just leaves me wanting more of this, since it seems like it'd be a really fun Western story, and it ending off so abruptly is kind of disappointing to me. Blue Jays breaks the trend, with him going to the far future of the 30th century, just in time for auditions for the Legion of Superheroes. This one is another laugh-a-panel one. Call me biased, but anything cracking fun at the Legion tryout process always gets me. And I love how quickly the founder trio goes from idolizing Blue Jay to immediately and callously dismissing him when they hear what his powers are. It really is in line with Silver Age Legion, where they'd just be total dickheads to potential applicants for no good reason. It'd be hard to list every story that happened in, to be totally honest. I love how they don't even recognize him or bother to listen to what he's saying, dumping a flight belt in his hands and telling him to fuck off. And I love Polar Boy swooping in to poach Blue Jay the second he gets rejected for the Substitute Legion, for another exciting adventure of doing fuck all because the Substitute Legion was a joke in the Silver Age. I really love the attention to detail here. Getting Kurt Swan in to do the art was a brilliant move, and I like that there's enough here to place Blue Jay in a very specific period of time in Legion history. Ralph Dibny, the elongated man, finds himself in Victorian London, palling around with H.G. Wells and other famous authors of the day after accidentally stopping Professor Moriarty. Yes, really. This part is fairly uneventful, but Ralph, as always, is hilarious. I love him constantly cracking jokes about Wells's books, despite them not existing yet. Ralph somehow pissing off Sherlock Holmes is funny too, but other than that, there's not much else in this one. It ends with Wells revealing he's trying to make an actual time machine, which Ralph pitches in to help work on, presumably to use to go back home and rescue the League. Finally, Captain Atom returns after doing whatever the hell it was he was doing, just in time for Wave Rider to check the future of Power Girl's cat, which sets up the events of the story, explaining how the League got scattered across time and space. Other than the cat making these government goons job out, nothing really of worth occurs in this part. But with that all out of the way, the issue ends on a cliffhanger, as Wave Rider prepares to search Atom's future. Overall, JLE is another highlight of the event. While the less serious tone might contrast somewhat with the rest of the annuals, it's a welcome breather after the few that preceded it. I like that the different artists give each segment a distinct style, which helps each one stand out better, but them being fully standalone leads to a lot of wasted potential with some of the segments. I like the premise, and it's pretty well utilized. None of the parts overlap thematically or setting-wise, so it gets a lot of mileage. Finally, here we are at the end, the second and last issue of Armageddon 2001. Picking up from JLE's cliffhanger, we join Wave Rider in searching Atom's future. Now, I know I already warned about spoilers early on, but I'm really going to stress it this time. From this point on, the entire ending is going to be discussed in full, so if you did want to read it for yourself and want to remain surprised, now's your chance to stop. It's a harsh, grim future, where gangs roam the streets free of prosecution, and the police are uncaring and unwilling to do anything. We pick up in the midst of a firefight. Atom's children and grandchildren are mercilessly gunned down in the streets, and Nathaniel Adams is left to grieve, powerless to do anything about it. Having promised to never become Captain Atom again, his powers causing untold devastation on the laws of physics themselves, Adams struggles in vain to get some justice for his family. After being mocked by the cops, his complaints dismissed by their chief, and his family's bodies dumped unceremoniously in the city landfill, Nat snaps in rage, once more becoming Captain Atom and tearing across the city in a violent and bloody path of vengeance, obliterating everything and everyone in his path. It's a very drastic shift in tone compared to most of the other futures, and especially following up from JLE. You can really feel the strife and anguish he feels as you follow along and see him slowly become more infuriated with the state of his day, and his resulting freakout and tour of destruction feels weirdly cathartic despite how terrifying it seems. And Jurgens does a spectacular job at detailing the grimy, broken world that Atom lives in, decrepit buildings and graffiti everywhere, and the destruction and debris from Atom's chaotic rampage are quite harrowing. Whatever the case, Wave Rider's search is cut short, as due to a combination of the aforementioned instabilities that Adam's powers were causing, and Wave Rider's own abilities, Monarch is able to pass through the time stream, arriving in the present day.
What's the password?
I forgot. Oh wait, I remember. I'm the fucking Monarch. Let me in now.
Now free to put whatever plan he had cooking into motion, Monarch immediately begins inspiring very little fear or worry by jobbing out to Superman and the League for a bit before deciding to fuck off. As Wave Rider tries to explain what the hell just happened, and inadvertently blaming himself for Monarch's creation, Monarch begins the steps to put his great plan for conquest into motion. Kidnapping Hawk and Dove for reasons unknown, murdering Dove's boyfriend and taking her while she was on a camping trip, and taking Hawk while he was on his way to go see a Steven Seagal movie. And since this is 1991, that means Hawk was on his way to go see Out for Justice and, well, I mean, it's not his worst movie from the era, but come on Hank, you can do better than that. Monarch then goes on a crazy robbery spree, stealing all sorts of technological and scientific gizmos for his big plan, constructing a massive neutron bomb as part of a ploy to gather all the heroes at once and wipe them out in one fell swoop. This all culminates in Monarch brutally killing Dove in front of Hawk and sending him into a frothing rage. Hawk tears Monarch's helmet from his head and begins to mercilessly and violently beat Monarch to death to claim vengeance. But his vengeance is cut short as he's shocked to discover that Monarch was none other than Hawk himself, allowing himself to die in order to ensure his own creation. Hawk, driven to madness by the revelation and the grief from Dove's death, fulfills his destiny by donning Monarch's armor and picking up where his counterpart left off. Monarch lures all the heroes into the heart of Metropolis for a single climactic battle, intending to detonate the neutron bomb as his future self intended. As they work to evacuate the city and prepare for disaster, Wave Rider and the League debate on the best course of action, but find themselves out of time as Monarch arrives. I will say that this sequence of all the heroes running all across the city rescuing people and preparing for a crisis, it's a side of superheroes they don't really show much anymore. Monarch's arrival leads to a big dumb brawl with all the heroes and Monarch, with Monarch quickly turning the tide for himself, and nearly succeeds in his plan by detonating the device. However, Captain Atom, immune to the effects of the blast and blaming himself for Monarch's arrival in the past, uses his powers to contain and absorb the bomb's energies, keeping it from detonating and saving everyone. Unfortunately, Monarch has other plans and tries to stop Atom, the blast's energies surrounding them and seemingly erasing them from existence. The world is saved, Monarch's threat is no more, the dark future of his mad regime can no longer exist, and Wave Rider finally discovers that the mystery hero who saved his life was none other than himself the entire time, no doubt turning his counterpart into a schizophrenic nutcase because of this influence. But Dove and Atom are no more, and Hawk's betrayal have left a dark blanket of despair over the triumph. However, things aren't quite over yet, as we end on a cliffhanger where we see that Captain Atom has survived the effects of the blast, his interference having sent him hurtling back to prehistoric times, but unfortunately for him, so hasn't Monarch. And with that, Armageddon comes to a close. That was quite the surprising ending, wasn't it? For those of you following along at home, you're probably saying to yourself, wait a second, that doesn't make any goddamn sense. How the hell could Hawk be Monarch if we not only saw him fighting Monarch in the future, but we were told that Hawk couldn't be Monarch under any possible circumstance? Well, this is where we get into the major talking point about Armageddon, the reason why it was controversial back in the day. As you may have guessed, Hawk wasn't supposed to be Monarch. DC had committed one of the cardinal sins of storytelling, that being to make the decision to change the identity of the true culprit at the last second, making the mystery unsolvable and the ending becoming incoherent. So what gives? What would cause DC to make such a risky move in the first place? And more importantly, if Hawk wasn't Monarch, then who was? Now we do actually have a definitive answer for that, but I think it's more fun to figure it out for ourselves, and some astute viewers may have already guessed it. So let's take a look back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of this event and go over every single clue we're giving in all of the annuals. Every piece of information we're shown or told about Monarch, his motives, his personality, his power set, his fighting style, the tiny little scraps we're given of his physical appearance, and every other little tidbit of foreshadowing we're given, and use all of that to go through the list of every major DC hero currently alive and active at the time. Even being generous, narrowing it down to just characters shown in the advertisements and who appear within the event, by using what we know for sure about Monarch, then there can only be one possible answer. And that would be that Monarch's true identity was none other than Captain Atom. Yes, you did hear that correctly. Captain Atom, despite being the one who defeated Monarch and stopped his plan from succeeding, was ironically meant to himself be Monarch. So why make the change? Well, according to Dan Jurgens, a DC insider leaked out the ending to various comic news sources, and the reveal was quickly spread around and became common knowledge. Now, I couldn't find any concrete evidence supporting this, any news of anyone specific leaking it out, or any specific places it was revealed, so it seems more that particularly astute readers figured out the twist early on, and fans chatting with fans led to more and more people guessing it, whether they knew it or not. Whatever the case, DC felt threatened by this, assuming that if fans knew the ending to the event ahead of time, then they wouldn't bother with reading the rest of it, and more importantly, not buying the rest of it. And this is a very, very common mistake that gets made with these kind of big mystery stories, where they assume that the actual answer to the mystery is more important than the story itself, and will often go out of their way to shoot themselves in the foot to try and preserve the twist, not realizing that a well-crafted mystery will more often than not captivate the reader regardless of how much they know going in. And by changing it, they show no faith in their own product, and ultimately only end up harming it in the long run. So, in order to preserve the twist, DC altered the ending at the last second, making Hawk the culprit instead. Why Hawk was chosen out of every other possible character isn't exactly clear. I remember reading once before that Hawk and Dove was being slated for cancellation shortly after the event anyways, so DC decided to kill two birds with one stone, no pun intended, and make Hawk Monarch to give them an excuse to axe the book. However, I couldn't find the source I found this from again, so I won't stick to this for sure, so don't take it at face value. Whatever the case, DC decided to make a gigantic mistake by picking the one guy who couldn't be Monarch as the replacement. The book itself tries to handwave the change, using the aforementioned revelation that by using his powers to view someone's future, Wave Rider unintentionally eliminates that timeline from occurring, thereby making it so that anyone could become Monarch, as well as making Wave Rider accidentally responsible for Monarch's creation to begin with. However, this doesn't exactly hold up, because not only were Wave Rider's powers manipulated by the forces of order in the Hawk and Dove Annual, but we were also shown a near infinite number of potential timelines, none of which ever had either responsible for becoming Monarch, making the chances that Hawk was Monarch basically impossible. In fact, had DC picked literally anyone else, it wouldn't be nearly as bad as it had ended up being. But what's done is done, and Armageddon is permanently marred by DC's cowardice. Would it be more fondly remembered had DC not changed the ending, or at least picked a more likely culprit? No, not likely. The event overall is fairly mediocre. While the central gimmick is effectively utilized, and every issue takes a very different tone and direction, making each one stand out from the rest, most of them are pretty unmemorable, and their lack of influence on the core books in the majority of the cases makes them pretty unessential to check out. I certainly like a lot of the ideas presented in each future, and they're all concepts that have been better expanded on since. As they are here, many of them miss certain elements that lower their overall potential. The main plot itself is a fairly standard mystery. Since only a few of the annuals need to be read to get the full effect, nothing much significant is gleaned from any of them since they're meant to be read as the viewer chooses, in whatever order they wish. The inclusion of the metaplot does help in giving every annual a consistent overarching theme which keeps them all feeling like they belong, and stories made with the event in mind, rather than stories made offhandedly and given a theme label at the last second. And for better or worse, the relatively minor inclusion of the metaplot in the annuals means that while you can more or less pick up any of them without worrying about needing to read the rest, it also means you don't have much incentive to do so or to bother checking out the rest of the event should you choose one at random. But there is a great deal of care given with setting up and establishing the mystery of the event, even if the ending falls flatter than a pancake dropped off the Empire State Building. So what effect did Armageddon 2001 have on the DC universe as a whole? After all, it's not a big dumb event comic without some earth-shattering continuity changes. Well, other than Hawk's heel turn and Dove's death, not a whole lot, honestly. Since none of the annuals had any impact or involvement to the plots of their main titles, none of the events that occurred within them had any long-lasting effect on the books they came from. The sole exception to this is New Titans, as the events of the annual lead into a storyline titled Total Chaos, which focused on the aforementioned Team Titans in their plan to kill Donna Troy in order to stop chaos from existing, the team getting their own spin-off series focusing on them because of it. Armageddon was followed up by two 4-issue miniseries, Alien Agenda and Inferno. I never read either back when I first read the event, and I don't plan on talking about either, but they're not exactly necessary reads either way. Alien Agenda wraps up the cliffhanger ending of the main book, explaining how Captain Atom got back to the present day, Whereas Inferno has no connection to the event it shares a name with, other than Wave Rider's appearance, but features the return of the JSA to mainline continuity after Wave Rider and Spectre free them from limbo. Wave Rider would remain a main player in DC for some time, usually popping up whenever a story involved some kind of time shenanigans occurring, and would eventually start palling around with the Linear Men, aiding in their goal of fixing fuck-ups in spacetime. Wave Rider would eventually be killed off during 52, but would end up coming back at some point post-Flashpoint, although I couldn't quite figure out when or how, and apparently there's a second Wave Rider now too, and that one's Booster Gold? I have no damn clue, so don't ask. Up until his death, Hawk would remain as a villain in the DC universe, engaging in time-based shenanigans whenever he popped up. However, he would end up ditching the Monarch identity after a short while, but that's a story for another day at another hour. DC would attempt to backpedal on the ending many years later, making Captain Atom into Monarch during the events of Battle for Bloodhaven, an incredibly shitty miniseries connected to an even shittier event comic, giving him an entirely different motivation and reason for donning the armor. This didn't last very long, and was honestly more embarrassing than the ending to Armageddon to begin with, and was quickly forgotten about. Another attempted retcon was given in Jeff Johns' JSA run, where it was revealed that the ending of Armageddon was an elaborate ruse concocted by the wizard Mordru, who manipulated Hawk into believing Dove was dead and becoming Monarch as a part of a scheme that would involve him usurping the duo's powers for his own, and while this was put to effective use in that book, it has no major significance outside of the series, and has seemingly never been mentioned since. This too is largely too little too late, and feels a bit unnecessary to do considering how much time had passed since the story had happened. With all that aside, Armageddon finally comes to pass. It's definitely understandable to see why and how this story fell to the wayside, but to say it's worth being neglected or forgotten isn't quite the case. While there's not a whole lot that really stands out with it, each issue in a vacuum isn't terrible, and while it's not something you should really go out of your way to read or track down, I wouldn't say that there's nothing to enjoy or that you'd be wasting your time if you did so. And on that note, I believe that's all for this time. This has been Jay, and as I return to the void between pages, I look forward to when next we may meet, and I can share what else I've been reading.